the air was dry and still, and somewhere far away, a coyote cried into the night. The wind carried with it the smell of dust and old wood, like a forgotten dream left behind in the plains. There's something haunting about the old American West, not the kind you see in movies full of duels and gun smoke, but the quiet truth that lived in the spaces between. Behind every outlaw's name carved into history, there was a boy once, a boy who believed he was doing what he had to do to survive. And tonight, we remember one of them. His name was Jesse James. Before he became the legend whispered around campfires and printed on wanted posters, Jesse was just a quiet child born under the Missouri sky. He lived in a small farmhouse surrounded by the sounds of crickets and the heavy silence of the countryside. His father was a preacher, a man of faith, but when Jesse was just a boy, his father left to find gold in California and never came back. The house grew quieter after that. His mother, Zerelda, was strong-willed, but life on a broken farm with 3 children and no husband was hard. Jesse and his brother Frank learned early that the world was not a gentle place. When the Civil War broke out, the world around him changed forever. Missouri was torn apart, neighbors turned on neighbors, and law meant little when everyone carried a gun. Jesse's older brother, Frank James, joined the Confederate guerrillas, and soon the boy who once helped with the horses found himself caught in the same storm. By the time he was 16, Jesse rode with men who wore gray uniforms one day and hid in the woods the next. They called them bushwhackers. They fought not on open fields but from the shadows, and the war left deep scars that never healed. In those years, Jesse saw things no young man should see. He saw friends fall. He saw farms burn. He saw fear become a way of life. He began to understand something dark, that justice, in that time and place, was often just revenge wearing a badge. The war ended, but peace did not come. The James family returned home to a Missouri that was occupied and bitter. Union soldiers still patrolled the land, and Confederate sympathizers were treated as traitors. Jesse carried his anger like a stone in his chest. One hot afternoon, Union soldiers came to the James farm looking for Confederate guerrillas. Jesse's stepfather tried to stand up to them, and they hanged him from a tree outside the house. He survived, but barely. The boy who watched that day, the one who saw the rope tighten and his mother scream, would never again trust a man in uniform. And so, the seed of the outlaw was planted. When Jesse was barely 18, he followed his brother Frank once more, but this time, not into war, but into the uncertain freedom of bandit life. The Civil War had ended, but the South was full of men like them, soldiers with no army, no money, and no home. Many turned to the only skill they knew, fighting, riding, and taking what they needed. The railroads were new then, symbols of power and progress, but to Jesse, they represented the same men who had once burned his world. Robbing them felt like taking back what was stolen. The first robbery Jesse joined was small, a local bank in Liberty, Missouri. It was quiet that morning. The church bells rang across town as the men tied their horses near the square. Nobody expected violence in a place so ordinary. But when the shots rang out, and the dust filled the air, history shifted. The Liberty Bank robbery was one of the first daylight bank robberies in American history. The men got away, and the legend began. At first, Jesse didn't see himself as a villain. In his own mind, he was righting wrongs, taking from the powerful who had crushed his people. Many Southerners saw him as a hero. Newspapers in sympathetic states even painted him as a modern Robin Hood. But the truth was more complicated. The money didn't go to the poor, it went to keep the gang alive. Every heist meant another week without hunger, another night under the open sky. It was survival, plain and raw. Jesse's gang, the James Younger gang, grew famous across the country. They rode into small towns, their dust coats flapping in the wind, their faces calm but cold. They robbed trains, stagecoaches, and banks. Each robbery carried the same rhythm, thunder of hooves, the sharp commands, the clinking of coins and the smell of gunpowder. But with every heist, the line between rebellion and crime blurred. The newspapers loved him, and the people admired his defiance. Yet Jesse's life was no grand adventure, it was a constant flight from the law. There were moments, though, when the dust settled, and he felt the weight of it all. Nights when he lay beside the campfire, staring at the stars over the prairie. He'd think of his mother's house, the smell of the earth after rain, the years lost to anger. He was young still, but his eyes looked older than his years. There was a sadness in them, the sadness of a man who had become what he once feared. By his mid-20s, Jesse was one of the most wanted men in America. There was a bounty on his head so high that even his friends began to look at him differently. But he couldn't stop. Every time he thought of laying down his guns, the past came back, the war, the rope around his stepfather's neck, the ashes of his home. It was as if he was chasing peace but always riding further from it. One of the strangest things about Jesse James's story is how calm it often was. The movies show chaos, but the truth was quieter: long hours on horseback, the creak of saddles, the whisper of wind through dry grass. Between robberies, they hid in caves, barns, and the empty spaces of the West. Jesse liked to sit by rivers and polish his gun, not out of pride but ritual. He often wrote letters too, polite, careful letters to the newspapers defending his actions, explaining that he wasn't a murderer, just a man wronged by a corrupt world. Those letters showed a side most people never saw: intelligent, articulate, almost gentle. But peace never lasted. In 1876, Jesse and his gang decided to rob the First National Bank in Northfield, Minnesota, one of their most daring attempts. The town was small, and they expected little resistance. But the people of Northfield were brave. When the gang entered the bank, the townsfolk fought back. Gunfire echoed down the streets. By the end, 2 of Jesse's men were dead, and the rest scattered. Jesse and Frank barely escaped with their lives. It was the beginning of the end. After Northfield, the James Younger gang was finished. Jesse and Frank fled to Tennessee, living under false names. Jesse took the name Mr. Howard and tried to live a quiet life with his wife, Z, and their children. For a while, he almost did. He bought a small farm, played with his children, even went to church. But the past never really lets go. The law still hunted him, and paranoia grew like a shadow. He trusted no one. Sometimes, late at night, Jesse would sit on the porch, rocking slowly in the dark. He'd listen to the sounds of crickets and faraway trains. In those moments, you could almost imagine he was just another farmer, a man tired of running. But inside, he knew he could never stop being Jesse James. The outlaw name had grown larger than the man himself. It was his mask, his prison, and his curse. And that's how the first part of his life closes, not with a roar of guns, but with quiet exhaustion. A young man once full of fire, now worn thin by years of fear and wandering. The world around him had changed, the war was long gone, the West was settling, and men like him were no longer heroes of rebellion, but relics of a violent past. In that stillness, Jesse began to sense that his story was nearing its final turn. But he couldn't know that his end would come not from a lawman's bullet or a rival gang, but from something colder: betrayal. The year was 1881, and the sun over Missouri burned the same way it always had: steady, quiet, and indifferent to the lives beneath it. In a small farmhouse near St. Joseph, a man named Thomas Howard was living what looked, on the surface, like an ordinary life. He rose early, fed his horses, and spent his afternoons tending to his fields. His neighbors saw only a polite man, soft-spoken, with kind manners and a gentle wife. But the truth lay hidden just under that calm exterior. Thomas Howard was Jesse James, the most wanted outlaw in America. He had grown tired of running, but he had also grown addicted to the road. It was strange: peace made him restless. Every time he tried to live quietly, the silence reminded him of the noise he'd left behind. The world outside was changing too. The railroads had spread across the country, telegraphs carried words faster than horses could run, and new towns were rising from dust. The Wild West, the one Jesse knew, was fading. Men like him no longer belonged. But Jesse still had his family, and for a while, that was enough. His wife, Z, knew the truth of who he was, but she also knew the man behind the legend, the man who once brought her flowers, who sang old hymns under his breath when he thought no one was listening. Their children adored him. To them, he wasn't an outlaw. He was just Pa. Still, Jesse couldn't escape himself. He would often wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing phantom hoofbeats, seeing faces from the past, friends gone, men fallen. His brother Frank had finally decided to give up the outlaw life and surrender, leaving Jesse alone. And alone was something Jesse had never been good at. So he began to plan again. Small robberies, quick jobs, enough to feel alive, enough to chase that flicker of purpose that still burned in him. But the men who rode with him now were not like the old days. They were younger, hungrier, and not bound by loyalty. Among them were two brothers, Charlie and Robert Ford. The Fords admired Jesse, or at least pretended to. They smiled when he spoke, laughed when he joked, and nodded when he told stories of the old days. But deep inside, they were afraid of him. And greed, as it often does, began to whisper. Jesse didn't notice it at first. He saw in them what he used to see in himself, that restless need to matter. He treated them like younger brothers, trusting them, perhaps because he needed to believe someone still could be trusted. He didn't realize that there was a bounty waiting, and that Robert Ford was already in touch with the governor, looking for a way out of the outlaw's shadow. By 1882, Jesse's life had narrowed to small moments, the sound of his children's laughter, the creak of his saddle, the whisper of wind through the grass. The world had moved on, and he was a ghost wandering through it. He no longer robbed trains for the thrill but out of habit, like a man walking down a road that no longer leads anywhere. He still cleaned his guns every night, his motions slow and careful. Z would watch him sometimes, her face a mixture of love and fear. She never asked him to stop, she knew he couldn't. On the morning of April 3, 1882, the sun rose softly through the curtains of their small home. Jesse had breakfast with Z and the children. It was a quiet, ordinary morning. The Ford brothers were there too. Jesse spoke about one last job, a bank in Platte City. He seemed calm, almost peaceful. There was something strange about him that day, as if he finally understood that all his running, all his fighting, had led here, to this small, sunlit room. Before heading out, Jesse took off his gun belt. He noticed a dusty picture hanging crooked on the wall and stepped up on a chair to straighten it. As he did, Robert Ford stood behind him, his hand trembling slightly as it reached for his revolver. The room was so still that even the ticking of the clock felt loud. Then came the single sound that ended a legend, the shot that echoed through time. Jesse fell forward, never even turning his head. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Dust floated in the beam of sunlight through the window. Z screamed. The Ford brothers stepped back, their faces pale. Robert's hand shook. He had killed the man he claimed to admire, not in a duel, not in a blaze of glory, but from behind, while Jesse was unarmed. The newspapers later called him the coward Robert Ford, and that name followed him forever. When the news spread, people didn't celebrate. They mourned. To many in the South, Jesse James had become more than a criminal, he was a symbol of defiance, of a world that had been lost. Crowds gathered to see his body. Mothers wept, old soldiers stood in silence. The outlaw was gone, but the legend had just begun. In the days that followed, the story twisted into something larger. Songs were written, stories told, each one adding a new layer to the myth. Some said Jesse wasn't really dead, that he'd faked his death and ridden off west, living under another name. Others said the spirit of Jesse James still haunted the plains. But the truth was simpler, quieter, and sadder. A tired man had finally stopped running. What few people knew was how ordinary Jesse's final morning had been, the smell of coffee, the laughter of children, the sound of a man straightening a picture on the wall. That's the part history often forgets, that even the most feared outlaw was still human. After his death, his mother, Zerelda, kept his memory alive. She charged visitors to see his grave, telling stories of her brave boy who fought for justice. She believed, or maybe needed to believe, that he had been a good man deep down. And maybe he was. Because when you look closely, Jesse James wasn't a man born for violence, he was shaped by it. The world he grew up in left him no peace, and in chasing freedom, he lost it completely. As years passed, the towns he once rode through grew quieter. The old wooden saloons turned into stores, the railroads stretched further, and the open plains filled with fences and families. The Wild West was no longer wild. The names of outlaws became stories told by lamplight, part of the strange, sad poetry of America. Sometimes, late at night, people in Missouri still tell the tale. They say that if you listen closely near Kearney, on a still summer evening, you can almost hear the sound of hoofbeats, slow and steady, fading into the hills. Some say it's the wind. Some say it's the past remembering itself. But those who know the story know better. They say it's Jesse James, still riding home through the dusk, chasing a peace he never found in life. And maybe, in some quiet way, that's where the lesson lies. That the men we call legends were just people, caught between their past and their dreams, trapped by their choices, searching for meaning in a world that had already decided their fate. The Wild West made heroes out of the desperate, and villains out of the broken. But beneath all that dust and fame, there were hearts that longed for something simple: rest, love, forgiveness. And maybe that's why his story still touches us. Because behind every outlaw's name and every whispered tale of gunfire and gold, there's something deeply human: the wish to matter, the need to be remembered, and the quiet tragedy of those who could never escape themselves. Years slipped away after Jesse's death, the same way the wind wears down the edges of a stone. The Wild West that had once echoed with hooves and gunfire began to fall silent. The dust settled on empty roads, and the once restless towns grew still. There were no more outlaw gangs hiding in canyons, no more telegraph lines cut in the night. The land itself seemed to sigh, as if the story it had been telling was finally over. But memory has a strange way of refusing to fade. People could not forget Jesse James, the boy preacher's son who became the most feared man in America. His name lived on, whispered in saloons and sung around campfires. And like all legends, the truth became softer over time, reshaped by longing and nostalgia. The newspapers that once called him a murderer now called him a folk hero. Pain became poetry, and history became a bedtime story. In Kearney, Missouri, where Jesse had been born, his mother, Zerelda, lived on. Her hair turned silver, her back bent, but her voice never lost its fire. She told stories to anyone who came by the old James farmhouse, stories that painted her son not as a killer, but as a brave young man wronged by the world. People came from miles away just to meet her. She would sit on her porch, the evening light falling across her weathered hands, and speak of Jesse with both pride and sorrow. "He was a good boy," she'd say, her eyes glistening, "just born in a hard time." Visitors paid small coins to see Jesse's grave, and she used that money to survive. Some came out of curiosity, others out of reverence. They'd leave flowers, old bullets, or notes, as if asking forgiveness from a man they'd never known. The James farm became a place where myth and memory met, half museum, half shrine. And for Zerelda, it was her way of keeping him close. But time moves on, even for legends. The railroads connected the coasts, cities grew taller, and the Wild West became just another story for the new century. By the time the 1900s arrived, the last of the old outlaws were gone. The new generation had no memories of horses and dusty trails, they had cars and electric lights. And yet, when people read about Jesse James, they still felt something. A strange mix of fear and admiration. Maybe because he stood for something lost, a wild freedom that modern life could no longer offer. What most people forget is that Jesse's story wasn't about fame or glory. It was about consequence, the slow, quiet weight of choices. For every robbery there was a scar, for every escape a sleepless night. He lived fast, but he also lived afraid. Even in his calmest moments, he knew that his life was a borrowed one. He had escaped so many times that even he began to wonder when it would end. And maybe, in the end, that's why he let his guard down. Maybe that morning, when he took off his guns to fix the picture on the wall, he wasn't careless, maybe he was tired. Maybe he was ready. After his death, songs began to appear across America. The Ballad of Jesse James was sung by travelers and railroad workers, by people who had never seen Missouri but felt the pull of his legend. The song was simple, mournful, and it changed how people remembered him. In its verses, Jesse wasn't a criminal, he was a man betrayed by a friend, a symbol of loyalty lost. It was Robert Ford, that dirty little coward, the song said, and in those words, history itself took a side. It's strange how the world forgives its rebels when they're gone. What once made people fear Jesse now made them admire him. He became a story that parents told their children, not to glorify crime, but to remind them that every life, no matter how wild, carries a longing for peace. Years later, people began to claim they had seen him alive. Some said he'd escaped to Texas, others swore he was an old man living quietly under a new name. Even decades after his death, men would appear, gray-haired and limping, claiming to be Jesse James. It was as if the world wasn't ready to let him go. Zerelda never stopped believing he was special. When she died in 1911, at the age of 86, she was buried near him, her gravestone reading simply Mother of Jesse James. And the crowd still came, long after she was gone. They still come even now, over 100 years later. The farmhouse still stands, the same wind still blows across those Missouri fields, and the grave still bears fresh flowers. If you walk there in the evening, you can almost feel the ghost of that time. The sound of cicadas, the scent of old wood, and the hush that comes just before sunset, it's easy to imagine the young Jesse riding home, dust on his boots, his heart still half boy, half legend. The story feels close, like it's never really ended. What makes Jesse's life so haunting is how human it truly was. Beneath the myth, there was just a man shaped by his times, by war, by loss, by anger, and by hope. He wasn't a monster, but he wasn't a saint either. He was something far more ordinary, a man who wanted control over a world that kept taking it from him. And that, perhaps, is why his story still matters. In every age, people look for figures like Jesse, men who stand against the tide, who break the rules, who live on their own terms. But the truth, once you peel away the romance, is always gentler. Every outlaw's rebellion comes with a cost, and every legend carries loneliness at its core. Jesse James reminds us that even the wildest lives crave peace, and that sometimes, peace only comes when the story ends. The modern world has its own outlaws now, different faces, different struggles, but the same hunger still runs through them, the need to be seen, to be free, to be remembered. And so, as the stars rise over Missouri, and the night hums with the sound of the wind through tall grass, Jesse's story becomes not just history, but reflection. It's easy to forget that he was once just a boy in a dusty farmhouse, watching his father leave and his mother cry. It's easy to forget that he once loved, laughed, and believed in something bigger. But that's the quiet truth of all human lives, no matter how far we fall, we all begin the same way, fragile and full of hope. If there's a message buried in his story, it's not about glory or fame, but about the long shadow of choices. That violence never truly sets you free, and that running from the past only ties you to it more tightly. Jesse's guns brought him power, but they also took away his peace. The real bravery, perhaps, would have been to stop. In the calm of night, when the fire burns low and the world feels still, his story settles like dust in the air, quiet, timeless, and deeply human. The life of Jesse James, brutal and short as it was, still echoes because it reminds us that every person, even the ones we fear or misunderstand, carries a heart that once wanted something simple: safety, belonging, and love. And maybe that's why his name endures, not for the robberies or the fame, but for the haunting sadness that follows him. A sadness that belongs to anyone who's ever looked back and wished they'd chosen a different road. So when we think of the Wild West, the endless plains, the wooden towns, the lonely whistle of trains, we remember not the violence, but the stillness that came after. The stories of men like Jesse James don't just belong to history books, they belong to quiet nights, to the moments when we wonder what we might have done in his place, and to the soft realization that freedom, without peace, is only another kind of cage. And somewhere out there, beneath the vast Missouri sky, the wind moves gently across the old James farm. It stirs the grass, hums through the trees, and carries a whisper, not of gunfire or fame, but of rest. The kind of rest that Jesse never found in life, but perhaps, finally, found in the telling of his story.